So last week, the South African Reserve Bank launched new banknotes and coins. While the facelift was widely welcome, there was some criticism of the translation of the words Reserve Bank in Xitsonga. The old notes read Banginkulu and the N has now been dropped, and the new notes read Bangikulu. While this suspected typo became a cause for discussion, the Reserve Bank says the South African Language Board was extensively consulted. The Language Board said the words were accurate and correct and consistent with the revised spelling published by the board in May last year. However, native Xitsonga speaker Professor Tinyiko Maluleke says that this is a serious linguistic crime on the new banknotes. He joins us now to tell us more. Prof, thank you very much for your time. We'll discuss in a few moments your assertion that it should be the former Banginkulu. But you start in your opinion piece by laying the foundation and making us understand the historical significance or the linguistic crimes that were committed in the days of old under the apartheid regime. Talk to us about that in particular.
Yes, thank you very much, Dudu, and thanks for giving me time on your channel. It is indeed a fact that many African languages suffered a great deal of harm during the so-called reduction of these languages into writing. Many places changed, the place names rather, changed beyond recognition, and many surnames were harmed irrevocably, so much so that there are many people all across Africa who carry names that have no real meaning because the orthographies of the powerful in those days decided. So, in fact, Commissioner Street in Johannesburg was famous for the harm done to people's names, especially surnames. Sometimes people were given new names. So that's the history we come from. We are a wounded people as far as the use of our languages against ourselves is concerned. And one would think that 30 years, 29 years into democracy, this would not continue to happen. I understand that the South African Reserve Bank is not the authority on language. Theirs is to issue notes. But they then received advice from PenSouth. And PenSouth told them that this is the correct way. Now, I don't agree with many of what is said in America, even though I studied there. But there is a saying in America, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And this was fine. It was not broken. All along, the Reserve Bank has been using Banginkulu. And suddenly PenSouth tells them to do something different, and they just tag along. And I don't think that is has been very helpful, because what PenSouth is doing is to experiment. Now, indeed, PenSouth has a booklet which they published first in 2019, and I believe it was revised last year, on the basis of which they do this. But that's their book. You can't tell people we are correct because our own book says so. Who has been consulted around that book? Was it made known? Was it consulted widely with the traditional leaders of the community? With what other section of the community has this been consulted? And that, for me, is the problem to do.
Prof, you maintain the word Banginkulu is not only correct, it is aligned with our African cosmology. You then make a case by imagining a scenario where people are negotiating lobola, for instance, using this very same banknote with an incorrect capturing of the word. Why is this important?
You see, banknotes are very important, not just for practical reasons that we need them to go and buy a loaf of bread. That's at a very practical level. But banknotes also have ritual significance in many African communities. It is the banknotes that we use. We set aside. There are certain banknotes we set aside for lobola. we set aside for certain rituals that may be religious in nature. I would argue that next to cattle, sheep, and goats, banknotes are that important for African people. So when you fiddle with that, you are fiddling with the people's ability not merely to communicate with one another, but to communicate with what John Beatty, a Kenyan scholar, calls the living dead. Because these are notes that we use to create community between and among ourselves. You can't go send a delegation to pay lobola between families that is holding notes that speak against the very people who are engaged in that. So I just wanted to illustrate that banknotes are not merely a question of purchasing a packet of chips or a box of Kentucky. They also have ritual significance. And for that reason, it's not good enough to consult only with Pensalp, especially if Pensalp itself is mistaken and misled in this regard. Even if Pensalp was correct, let's say Pensalp was doing us a favor and we are too ignorant to understand the favor they are doing us. Let's say they had copyright on the language, that they owned the language and they can do with it as they please. Let's give them that. Even if that was the case, how would they help us understand what they have just done? They have done very little to help us understand it. Instead, what they have done when asked is to give us lectures about adverbs and verbs and adjectives and prefixes and suffixes. Not very many Xitsonga speakers working out in the fields will tell you, oh, my day is bad because of prefixes and suffixes and so on. So they have a responsibility not just to consult, but to communicate and get buy-in. They have not done that. So let's just stick with the word that we know is correct, which is Banginkulu.
Prof, just to wind it down, you mentioned a little bit earlier on that we are a wounded people when it comes to our names and our languages because of the historical injustices. What then is the recommendation? You do mention in your opinion piece that the backstory to this in terms of the Reserve Bank relying on Pensalp to give this meaning is infuriating. And so what would your firm recommendation be going forward?
My recommendation, first and foremost, the most immediate one, is to plead on my bended knees with the South African Reserve Bank to please revert to Banginkulu. They don't have to invent anything. They just need to go back to what they were doing 6 weeks ago and use the word that they have always used. That's the most immediate plea that I'm making with them. I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's impossible. They don't have to send out research groups anywhere. They just revert back to the word that they were using, which was acceptable to everyone. In the long term, I would suggest that Pensalp, if they are going to write a book that is going to change the way 10% of the South African population speaks and writes their language, they should do a lot more to make that book known, to consult it widely, and to communicate with the owners of the language, which is not a committee, but the people. That's what I would recommend.
Prof, thank you very much for your time this morning.